Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs programme and podcast from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This week, moral clarity. We focus in on voices, Ukrainian and Russian, offering a vision of a world without war.
I will be celebrating, I guess. I will have fun. I so much missed having fun, dancing, having something which is not work, which is not campaigning.
And prescient moments, why the commemoration of the end of Spain's fascist dictatorship is causing so much controversy 50 years after the death of Franco. That's all here on Inside Europe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has agreed to US proposals for a 30-day ceasefire. As of recording, the ball is now, as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio put it, firmly in Russia's court. The ceasefire plans were hatched during intense talks between US and Ukrainian officials this week in Saudi Arabia, after which the US announced the resumption of military aid and intel sharing with Ukraine. Also under discussion, but crucially not yet signed, a controversial deal that would give the United States a 50% stake in revenues from the sale of Ukraine's mineral wealth. The talks were an attempt to reset US relations with Ukraine after that meeting. You know the one I mean? 2 weeks ago in the Oval Office?
And he happens to be right about
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the
the
cards right now. With us, you start having
not
cards.
playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
Very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing
Now, I really did think long and hard before playing that clip of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance haranguing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky there. Partly it's because I assume that everyone is by now familiar with it, and partly because of its performative violence. However, the violence was, of course, precisely the point. That moment was experienced by many here in Europe as a shocking rupture, a sort of day zero after which nothing would ever be the same. Svitlana Romanko, the Ukrainian environmental lawyer and founder of the Razom We Stand organisation, told me that for her, the time since has felt like being catapulted back to the first dark days of Russia's full-scale invasion.
It was exactly the same feeling, even a bit more darker, and I will explain why. 3 years ago, the invader was only Russia, but this time we felt that the US is joining them, and in a very powerful and defined manner, and we, of course, were extremely upset and frustrated seeing our democratic ally who responded to the call to ban Russian fossil fuels immediately in the first few weeks of Russian full-scale invasion in March and April 2022. And they recently started saying that it might be not that clear who is an invader, and it sounds terribly aggressive and also passively aggressive.
Ukraine, of course, was invaded, and it has suffered and is still suffering.
Many changes happened over these 3 years, not just terrible changes to our cities being leveled to the ground, to citizens, civilians being attacked while sleeping peacefully in their apartment buildings, in their homes, and many, many more. Children kidnapped massively, 20,000 of Ukrainian children kidnapped.
Svitlana Romanko was one of the first Ukrainians that I spoke to back in February 2022 in those early days of Russia's full-scale invasion. As an environmental lawyer, she immediately identified oil and gas as the engines of war and founded the campaign organisation Razom We Stand around the demand for an immediate global halt to Russian oil and gas imports, a demand which, she is keen to point out, is still to be fully met, particularly in relation to liquid petroleum gas, which European nations imported in record quantities last year, even as the EU talked tough on standing up to Russia. When we spoke this week, Svitlana made it absolutely clear that she still regards fossil fuels as the bleeding heart of this conflict.
Fossil fuel profits are occupying this planet. I encourage all of us to think that we are all living in an occupation in the ways that this occupation is being made and also strengthened by fossil fuel regimes that directly benefit on them. And even now, tracking the US and Ukraine peace negotiations happening in Saudi Arabia, I can't stop thinking that actually USA and also Saudi Arabia and Russia own roughly a half of planet's supply of crude oil. And I think the most important action for now is to continue work with Europe and European countries. The other strategic dimension is to keep trying for the US not to become a total accomplished fossil fuel autocracy.
We've talked about fossil fuels, Svitlana, but I need to talk to you about minerals, because Donald Trump has made it very clear that his support for Ukraine is conditional upon a minerals deal. What are these minerals that Ukraine has, and what are they used for?
So Ukraine is indeed a home for about 5% of the world's critical raw materials, including lithium, cobalt, graphite, scandium, tantalum, and niobium. These minerals are essential for the clean energy transition. Especially lithium is a vital mineral which is used in batteries production. And it will be key for Ukraine as we wean ourselves of fossil fuel imports, especially from Russia, to use our critical raw minerals carefully and to build the renewable economy we all want. And of course, our goal is to have full energy security in Ukraine with decentralized clean energy. And to be a clean energy exporter to the EU, it's been multiple times mentioned by the government and the governmental agencies that we very much want to align with the Repower EU plan, which is about abandoning and completely stopping using Russian gas for any purpose within the European Union by 2027. There are some players that we can learn from, and we can actually build a fruitful collaboration, but not just become a raw material colony for the West. That's absolutely not a desirable outcome for us, as we are so much fighting for our energy independence, and we will not accept an exploitative system in which Ukraine simply exports its raw materials without reaping the economic benefits for the local people.
Finally, Svitlana, you who have been so clear-sighted in articulating the demands that Ukraine needs to be making towards its European allies in relationship to fossil fuels, what can the demand be now in relation to minerals that Europe will, of course, need if it is to complete its own renewable transition?
The EU still imports some critical minerals from Russia. They are called critical because they are critical. We can't replace them. So what I would appreciate seeing actually stop importing those Russian minerals, critical minerals, which actually is 30% of nickel and alumina imports that came from Russia before the invasion and continued flowing. And I would say the most important task is Repower EU plan, which is currently being slightly delayed. This plan should be expanded to include a strategy to eliminate reliance on Russian critical raw materials, but also Europe should partner with Ukraine to develop a sustainable, transparent and ethical critical raw minerals industry that aligns with European environmental standards and social standards. And of course, the investment into Ukrainian critical raw materials sector must be about long-term security and not short-term exploitation. It's so important how we take care of each other in this long-term fight that we are all in. And this is, as I said at the beginning, it's not just about Ukraine, it's about all Europe and security, renewable energy that will hopefully power every home and also every industry and make it a win-win for Europe and Ukraine, but not just for fossil fuel autocrats.
What will you be doing if we get to that place?
Oh my God, I will be celebrating, I guess. I will have fun. I so much missed having like fun, dancing, having something which is not work, which is not campaigning, but I can't have it right now because in solidarity with our people on the front lines and everyone in Ukraine, it just doesn't feel appropriate. But I will definitely will make a pause for 1 week when we achieve there. And I will take a look at my beautiful house, fully powered by renewable energies. I will maybe look for some other green job which will become available for me in my area. And my children and family will be able to do the same, and the friends and our community. Having ability to speak Ukrainian, to sing our songs, to celebrate our cultural events, this is still very, very important, and that's what I want to preserve as well for many years.
Svitlana Romanko is a Ukrainian environmental lawyer and founder of the campaign organisation Razom We Stand. Razom in Ukrainian means together. Now, dissent at the beginning of a country's authoritarian turn takes courage. But what courage must it take to speak out 25 years into an authoritarian leader's grip on power? Astonishingly, however, some Russians are still doing exactly that. Levi Bridges has been profiling two of them.
Hello, Olivia. Меня зовут Сергей Трошин. Сейчас у меня нет никакой должности, потому что все мои должности...
Sergei Throshin is one of the only Russian politicians who is openly gay. He first got into politics in his home city of St. Petersburg more than a decade ago. He told me over the phone recently that things were different back then in Russia.
тогда, еще 19-й год, еще такие, как ни странно, можно сказать...
It was a somewhat freer time then, because Russia didn't have such harsh laws against LGBTQ+ people, and voters in St. Petersburg are more liberal, so it was possible for a queer person to enter politics.
Throshin was eventually elected as a deputy in St. Petersburg with the Liberal Party, Yabloko, and he was a little bit of a rebel. In a video posted on Facebook back in 2015, Throshin stands at a meeting with local politicians, waving a rainbow flag. These days, Russians could be jailed for pulling stunts like this. According to the Russian Supreme Court, the international LGBTQ+ movement is an extremist organization. Under Russian criminal law, participating in or financing an extremist organization is punishable by up to 12 years in prison. A person found guilty of displaying such group symbols faces up to 15 days in detention for the first offense and up to 4 years in prison for a repeat offense. Denouncing the war in Ukraine now comes with hefty penalties too. And yet, some Russian politicians are still publicly expressing opinions that go against the Kremlin. In a video posted on YouTube, an 83-year-old woman from St. Petersburg named Lyudmila Vasilyeva rails against the local government. I won't hand our city over to a bunch of bandits, Vasilyeva says. Last year, Vasilyeva ran to become the governor of St. Petersburg, calling for an end to the war in Ukraine. Vasilyeva tells me over Zoom that the reaction was amazing.
Люди приходили не только из Петербурга, приезжали из других городов.
People from all over Russia and even abroad supported our campaign, and then were kind of envious that we managed to launch this kind of campaign in today's Russia.
Vasilyeva's case shows that Russia's authorities still do occasionally tolerate some level of dissent from candidates, although many eventually get pushed out of politics. Last year, politician Sergei Throshin was labeled by the authorities as a foreign agent, which makes him ineligible to hold office. But still, Throshin is proud that he managed to bring attention to Russia's queer community, even if it was part of what likely ended his political career.
После того, как об этом камин-ауте стало известно,
After coming out as gay, I received a lot of messages from LGBTQ+ people in Russia, expressing gratitude and support. And I think that me being a public figure in some way helped reduce homophobia in Russia.
Vasilyeva, the pensioner who ran for St. Petersburg's governorship, couldn't even get enough signatures to get on the ballot. Her son, Denis, who helped organize the campaign, says people are afraid to publicly support the opposition.
I had colleagues who told me, look, I'm sorry, I really want to support your mother with my signature, but we're just too afraid. Lots of Russians who have spoken out against the war have left the country, so getting enough signatures to participate in the election was impossible.
Onerous bureaucracy, like signature requirements, aren't the only way Russia's government has weakened the opposition. Mitchell Pullman has worked as an election observer in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. He says authorities also send politicians threats that they could lose their jobs.
And nobody wants to stick their neck out and risk their livelihood, for politics, basically.
And if that fails, the government can just make false accusations that force politicians to resign. Irina Busigina is a Russian political scientist at Harvard.
They can be declared foreign agents, extremists, terrorists, and this is how you get rid from the best people, I would say.
That's exactly what happened to Sergei Throshin, the politician who was labeled a foreign agent. But he hasn't given up on his political dreams.
I believe Russia will eventually become a free and democratic country. And when we finally have competitive politics, the opposition really has a great chance of success.
Ludmila Vasilyeva, the 83-year-old pensioner who ran for governor of St. Petersburg, says, yes, she didn't get on the ballot, but she still got an important message across.
Our campaign slogan was St. Petersburg, City of Peace. I hoped that our message would make people all over Russia rise up in a chorus and proclaim that they didn't want war too.
Of course, that's not what happened. But the grandmother did vocalize her opposition to the war. And in Russian politics these days, that's a rare and not insignificant achievement. Levi Bridges, DW.
Do the big things whilst they're small. You're listening to Inside Europe. I'm Kate Laycock. Back in a minute.
Hi, it's Lacey Healy. When members of Congress and even the vice president are sworn into office, they say an oath to protect the country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. But what does a domestic enemy look like?
January 6th, it was coming from the top.
Some of them are bad people, but most of them are just normal people.
As if we weren't all stressed out enough. A new season of Things That Go Boom is available now wherever you get your podcasts.
2025 is the year in which Spain marks 50 years since the death of General Francisco Franco, the dictator who ruled the country from the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939 right through to his death in 1975. Spain's socialist Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, is rolling out a series of 100 events spread out over the year in order to celebrate Spain's half-century of democracy and to remind citizens of the lessons of their not-too-distant past. It's a move that has not been without controversy. As we'll hear in this report from our Madrid correspondent Ashish Sharma, it's not just the far-right Vox party that is boycotting the events, but members of the conservative Partido Popular as well.
My name is Elisa Vigil González. I'm the spokesperson of the Partido Popular in the Asamblea de Madrid, in the regional parliament of Spain. We all live in a democracy. We have a constitution since 1978 here in Spain. Right now, Franco is everywhere because they need to try to move the population in the division of the civil war we had in Spain many, many years ago. We didn't live the civil war, but it's like more alive than ever. And it's sad that they are not facing the situation of the economical situation we are facing in Spain.
Vigil suggests that the past be the past, the country must build on its future. But Franco's dictatorship reverberates into the present, right into the heart of Spain's political system.
Que se recrudecen cuando avanzamos, porque ladran, luego cabalgamos.
Santiago Abascal, leader of Spain's far-right Vox party, held a summit in Madrid with all the major European far-right and right-wing populist parties in attendance.
Y gracias, querida Marine Le Pen, que eres un auténtico ejemplo de resistencia para todos nosotros.
Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini, leading lights of the far right, applauding enthusiastically as Abascal decried that Europe was losing its Christian identity in the face of an Islamic takeover.
Se alíen para impedir vuestra victoria. Cada vez les queda menos tiempo. Seguimos tus pasos.
According to Alex Quiroga, a professor of Spanish history at Madrid's Complutense University, the seeds of the emergence of a far-right party in Spain were planted soon after the death of Franco.
The Spanish right, or the current Conservative Party, was created by a number of Francoists. That's part of the problem, because there was never a full rejection, a full condemnation of the Franco dictatorship. That meant that when a proper sort of pro-Francoist far-right party emerged, that was a splinter group from the Partido Popular. The number of agreements in between the conservatives and the far-right has been unproblematic precisely because they both come from the very same political culture.
Because free Spain, that's what he was suggesting yesterday. But
I would say like freedom in Spain in 2 years, I don't know.
Yeah, freedom in Spain.
Carmina Gustran is the commissioner who's been put in charge of organising all the events, over 100 of them, in a series called Spain in Freedom for 50 years. Over the coming year, events ranging from concerts, film festivals, conferences, and even an escape room will be organised. Carmina says that there are 3 aims behind all the events that are being planned.
We want to celebrate the country we have become in cultural, political, social terms. We want to pay tribute to all the people who were fighting against dictatorship, the dictatorship of Franco, and who helped in bringing democracy. And we want to promote democracy. We want to promote democracy in this particular time where it seems to be under threat in so many parts of the world.
Well, you can do an act, not 100. 100 acts they're gonna do from the government. 100. And they don't know even how much will cost. People, they don't have the money to buy a home. And we're spending the money of them in that ridiculous way.
Ridiculous or not, the die has been cast, and what washes out in the rinse will inevitably be marked by the political colours that divide this country.
Casi medio siglo nos separa de su muerte, pero
the question that will be raised with each passing event is just how relevant Franco is to Spain today. Given that one of the major governing parties, the Partido Popular, was born from the ashes of the political system built by Franco, and that today the far right is a political force, suggests that politically at least, Franco has left a lasting legacy.
De la dictadura franquista a las que hoy estamos rindiendo homenaje.
Ashish Sharma, DW, Madrid.
There are so many well-written accounts of Spanish 20th century history, but perhaps strangely, my tip for a sense of life and resistance under Franco's dictatorship is actually Guillermo del Toro's classic magical realist film, Pan's Labyrinth. You're welcome. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs programme and podcast from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. Now, here in Germany, domestic political news is, of course, dominated by the ongoing attempt to form a government following national elections last month. There have been various setbacks this week, hinging around the attempt by presumed Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz to use the outgoing parliament to pass through legislation overhauling Germany's constitutionally enshrined limits on government borrowing or debt brake. Basically, the Green Party are worried that the extra spending could be used on campaign pledges rather than green infrastructure projects, and the far right and far left are questioning the constitutionality of bypassing the newly elected parliament altogether. That, however, is not what I wanted to focus on. What I wanted to take a closer look at this week is a document called a Sondierungspapier, which I guess we could translate as exploratory talks paper or simply statement of intent. Basically, in the German system, potential coalition partners come together around a document setting out what they want to achieve in the coming legislature. It's not legally binding, but it does provide a useful insight into the tone and direction of the political consensus that is likely to shape Germany in the years to come. Of course, there is an urgent need for strong leadership in Germany at the moment as Europe deals with an unprecedented suite of geopolitical challenges. But is there a danger that that might come at the expense of rights and freedoms at home? One section of the exploratory talks paper in particular, the one on migration, which includes proposals for sending refugees back at the borders, suspending reunification rights and resuming deportations to Afghanistan and Syria, made me think that what I'd really like to do this week is put the Sondierungspapier to the human rights test. Luckily, I was able to call up Hugh Williamson, Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, and ask him to take me through it.
The language in that section is pretty hostile or negative towards asylum seekers and migrants, and that's a worry, of course. It's clear that Germany needs to protect its own borders and has the right to do so, but it's also an obligation for Germany to uphold its international commitments on granting asylum to people who have the right to claim asylum in this country. Germany also needs migrants. I'm sure your program has focused on that many times as well. I mean, it's an economy where people are aging and there's a greater need for international migration into the country. So we need to find a way forward for the country based on those sorts of elements rather than on the negative tone and the sort of scapegoating, really, that we saw in the election campaign towards migrants, blaming them for things which are not really their fault, running through this text. So that's our sort of an overall concern, and we do hope that the proposals that are made are implemented in the context of Germany's international and European commitments on migration. We are pleased that there is a commitment to implementing the EU asylum rules. I mean, those rules themselves, which were adopted last year, are problematic in themselves, but nevertheless they do provide a firm basis, an overall basis for protection of asylum rules and protection of migrants and support for migrants when they come into Europe. We're pleased that that is going to be implemented, but there are other aspects which you mentioned in your introduction which are problematic.
So one aspect that I didn't, I think, mention in my introduction, Hugh, was this section. I'm going to quote, "We remain committed to the reform of citizenship law. We will examine under constitutional law whether we can withdraw German citizenship from terror supporters, anti-Semites and extremists who call for the abolition of the free and democratic basic order if they have another nationality."
Yes, indeed. I mean, the idea of stripping people of German citizenship in principle is problematic because obviously those cases would be for dual citizens, and that creates a sort of a two-level society, that those who have a second nationality are more vulnerable. Now, of course, there may be some cases where it's legally sound to do this, but introducing this idea into German law that people's citizenship can be stripped from them if they have a second nationality, as we say, is is a problematic development that we would like to understand better and we would like to discuss with the government before it's fully implemented.
I think I'd actually like to ask you specifically about the language here around, quote, terror supporters and anti-Semites, because we've covered on the programme before the way in which some Jewish and many Muslim voices have felt that the German authorities' interpretation of the definition of anti-Semitism is silencing legitimate critique of Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank. So in the context of that debate, is the language of that particular passage of concern to you?
Yes, it is. It is. And those are for the points you just made. I mean, it comes in the context of developments in Germany over the last couple of years, particularly since the Gaza crisis started, as it were. Anti-Semitism is a problem, is a significant problem in Germany. We need to name that at the beginning. It needs to be tackled, and it's appropriate the government is taking sort of concerted action to tackle anti-Semitism in Germany. On the other hand, Islamophobia is also a significant problem in Germany. So there's a danger that stripping citizenship of people allegedly who are anti-Semitic could fuel further Islamophobia in Germany. And as you say, the way the German authorities have been approaching this issue more broadly has been to penalize legitimate criticism of Israel under the label of anti-Semitism. So the authorities need to be very, very careful as they go forward on this basis and not to be too broad in their understanding of what this anti-Semitic activity is, which could lead to the stripping of citizenship. So, we are significantly concerned about this inclusion in this paper, which moves towards coalition agreement. And we're, as I said, very keen to understand what they mean by it and to advocate for, at the very least, a very tightly defined definition of what they mean by anti-Semitism.
Policing, Hugh, and freedom of expression, they were both topics that were raised as issues of concern in Human Rights Watch's World Report relating to Germany. We're speaking after very shocking videos of police violence directed against demonstrators at the Women's Day demonstrations in Berlin have been circulating online. Policing and freedom of expression are not actually topics that are discussed in this paper, perhaps surprisingly given that policing is usually a favourite topic for the CDU.
That's a good point, yeah.
So I suppose the question is really about what's missing. What would you have liked to have seen in a document like this?
Yeah, we would have liked to have seen a clear understanding of what the right to protest means these days in this modern Germany for the German society, as you said at the beginning, what that would mean, and an articulation of that. We've seen in the last 12 to 18 months heavy restrictions both on pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Germany and on environmental protests as well, heavier policing and heavier criminal sentencing than perhaps by in other cases regarding far-right or AfD protests and so on. So that's really worrying. We would have liked to have seen an articulation both of the role of the police, which perhaps would have come from a CDU perspective, but also articulation of what that right to protest means. Now, when we look at the women's protests, the International Women's Day protests on Saturday, they are indeed shocking videos. The police statements I've read was there were some provocation or violence towards the police. That needs to be investigated. But of course, the actual violence by the police themselves needs to be investigated as well. That shouldn't be acceptable on German streets. German police need to act in a proportionate way, using violence in a proportionate way, if necessary, in response to what happens during protests, and it's unclear whether that took place in that context. So that's the sort of, a clear articulation of the right to protest is necessary, if not in this document, but in the coalition document itself. Upholding basic freedoms and basic human rights is missing from this document. We hope there will be more concerted action on the part of the government to tackle racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, as I mentioned before, to create a more tolerant society, one which is robust and ready to stand up to the challenges of the far right, which is such a significant issue in Germany these days.
Well, yeah, indeed. I wanted to ask you about that because in recent days there have been a spate of parliamentary questions asked at a federal and a regional level, not just by the AFD, but by the CDU as well, all about the funding of a whole list of civil society organisations, many of whom have been instrumental in pushing back against far-right narratives and organising. So what concerns does this development raise for you?
Indeed. I mean, these parliamentary questions, which have been posed both by the CDU on the day after the election, so on February 24th, and then by the AfD in the last few days, are really, really worrying because it's clear from political developments in Europe that the further centre-right parties go towards the far right, which is in a sense what the CDU is doing. They're engaging with the politics of the AfD by stigmatising non-governmental organizations for their legitimate work. The further the parties like the Christian Democrats go down that path, that actually reinforces the messages and the appeal of the so-called real thing, the far-right party themselves, the AfD. So it doesn't actually help distinguish significantly between the Christian Democrats and the AfD. That's the sort of political analysis of it. In terms of the substantive point, that stigmatization of civil society in a country like Germany is so deeply worrying because it's what's been happening in many authoritarian countries around the world, and seeing that trend happening here is simply shocking.
And of course, Germany's ability to provide strong leadership on the international stage is intricately linked to its democratic credentials at home.
Absolutely. Those things are completely linked also within Europe as well. I mean, there's so many challenges. We didn't mention the role of German business as well. Third largest economy in the world. There's no mention in the statement for sort of the need for business to uphold social conditions in the way they work. The whole issues around supply chains and so on. We hope that Germany will continue to play a role against child labour, forced labour, and so on, both in Germany but also in Europe, and implement the European Supply Chains Directive quickly. Things like that, you know. There's a lot of talk about cutting bureaucracy and so on, but some key elements are where Germany and Europe are setting the standard around the world, and that needs to continue.
Hugh Williamson is Europe and Central Asia Director for the NGO Human Rights Watch. It's not just Germany that is seeking tougher controls on migration, of course. Earlier this week, the European Commission proposed that member countries be allowed to set up so-called return centres in non-EU countries. There are various irregular migratory routes into Europe, all of them fraught with danger. In our next report, we'll be zooming in on the situation in Latvia, a key crossing point into the bloc from Belarus. Our reporter is Ben Batka.
With its Soviet-era apartment blocks, the Latvian village of Mucineki, located a 45-minute drive east of the country's capital Riga, doesn't look too different from other small municipalities in the Baltic country. But walk a few meters from Mucinieki's only bus stop and food store, and you'll discover one of Latvia's 2 reception centers for migrants. It houses an estimated 200 asylum seekers and refugees, including families, from more than a dozen countries, around a third of Mucinieki's shrinking population. At a recently upgraded soccer field next to the facility, one of the few notable places here, I strike up a conversation with a group of Afghans. One of them is Faisal Hajib, which is not his real name. Faisal left Afghanistan in 2021, fearing retribution from the Taliban for having worked for Western countries. When he first entered Latvia from Belarus last July, border police caught him and 14 other migrants. He claims that Latvian border guards then beat them up unprovoked, with the goal to prevent them from returning to Latvia.
When we stop it, they hurt us a lot and they take us to the road. And they told us to lay down, and they step their foot in our neck and hurt us a lot.
Lifting his black sweatpants, Faisal reveals dark hematomas he says he received from Latvian border guards. He also shows me pictures of when he was wearing bandages and band-aids around one of his arms and both of his legs, as well as pictures of other migrants' injuries that he says stem from the same beating.
You cannot walk and you cannot come again to the Latvia because they hurt you, especially in the foot, where you don't see it, where you can't show to someone.
While it's impossible to independently verify what Faisal claims, His allegations are in keeping with human rights violations by Latvian authorities documented in reports by Amnesty and other organizations. Altogether, Faisal says border guards walked over their necks more than 10 times.
After that, they take us one by one to the police car. There was a car don't have the seats. 3 border police was in the car. And when you in the car, they will starting to hurting you with 3 batons. When they see that you are hurt really badly, they will pick you down from the car.
After approximately 7 hours, Faisal says, police took them back across the border to Belarus through a door in the double mesh fence topped with barbed wire.
They take our phones also. We cannot send location for someone, for agent, those guys that help us to come here. We was lucky that we found one Pakistani guy in the forest, and he has the phone and he helped us. He was from other agents. I was thinking that maybe I will die in this forest.
Faisal says virtually every migrant he spoke to encountered violence by police or border police in Latvia.
You have arrived.
To find out how the border guard reacts to these accusations, I drive the 3 hours from Riga to the border with Belarus. I have an appointment with Vladimir Šersts of Latvia's border guard force. Together with the Latvian-Russian border, the unit is responsible for roughly 450 kilometers of the EU external border. After a bumpy ride from the border guard station to the border with Belarus, I ask Šersts what happens when they detect an unauthorized border crossing.
First of all, border guard evaluate this person. If this person needs medical assistance or any other kind of support, like clothes, food, water. If nothing is needed, this person is prevented from the illegal border crossing and sending back to the territory of Belarus.
Latvian border guards are legally allowed to use physical force to return irregular migrants to Belarus. In an email, Latvia State Border Guard says this has happened only once since August 2022, adding that the use of physical force is a quote-unquote last resort. Regional Acting Border Chief Vladimir Šersts insists that border guards only use force when migrants resist removal to Belarus or when they use force themselves. And when pressed, he plays down the dangers resulting from pushing migrants back across the border.
Almost everybody trying to cross the border illegally are men aged from 18 to 35, 40 years. They're healthy, they are strong, they doesn't need any help from us like medical assistance, and they are willing to get to Europe by all means.
On my way back to Riga, I stop in the small town of Silin, not far from the border. There, I find 2 graves, freshly dug. The graves are anonymous. The migrants they belong to were never identified. Migrant aid groups say they recorded 116 deaths on the EU-Belarusian border over the past 3 years. The real number is likely a lot higher. The Latvian government justifies pushing migrants back across the border with Belarus with security concerns. Latvia and other EU countries have repeatedly accused Belarus of encouraging and facilitating migration, calling it a hybrid attack. Back in Riga, I visit the office of I Want to Help Refugees, which grew out of a Facebook group in 2015. When asked about rhetoric like hybrid attack and denying migrants the chance to claim asylum, border monitoring expert Anna Grike says both of it is disproportionate.
Of course, there has been some kind of boosting of activity by Belarusian authorities, but it was in the very beginning. Now it's an average road people are taking. It's there for stay, and it's definitely not an attack. The number of people arriving and the capacity to accept people, to deal with asylum cases, we are more than ready to do that.
The UN Refugee Agency also says effective border management is possible while allowing migrants to seek asylum. I Want to Help Refugees says it has migrants' testimonies of physical and emotional violence and illegal pushbacks. It also claims that several migrants died or had their limbs amputated as a result of being forcibly returned to Belarus. To Grike, a lack of scrutiny and transparency makes accountability all but impossible.
It's very bad, not only pushbacks, but also the use of physical force and different means to do so are allowed. They can beat, use electroshock, use dogs, and this is all legal. But you are denying, I'm more than persuaded, that not all state border guard is in favor of pushbacks, is in favor to use the force, but since it's so untransparent, there are no truly empowered bodies to supervise the actions of state border guard.
Migrants started to arrive in large numbers from Belarus on the borders with Latvia, Lithuania and Poland in August 2021. All three states then declared states of emergency and introduced pushback laws. Latvia's border guard says its personnel intercepted and forcibly returned more than 5,000 migrants from Latvia to Belarus last year alone. Back in Berlin, I meet up with Faisal again, the Afghan refugee I met on the soccer field in Muciniki. He's made it to Germany, but the authorities recently told him that he needs to return to Latvia because that is where he was first registered. He's contemplating seeking church asylum, but fears that the future is bleak.
What will be the next step of the European Union? If they send me back to Afghanistan, to Latvia, I have hope to live in here and follow my dreams.
Ben Bartke, DW for Inside Europe.
And you can find additional reporting and information on the so-called Belarus route at infomigrants.net. You're listening to Inside Europe. Our feedback address is insideeurope@dw.com. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn.
Hey everybody, I'm Kai Rizdal, the host of Marketplace, your daily download on the economy. Money influences so much of what we do and how we live. That's why it's essential to understand how this economy works. At Marketplace, we break down everything from inflation and student loans to the future of AI so that you can understand what it all means for you. Marketplace is your secret weapon for understanding this economy. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
As the so-called eggflation crisis continues in the US, here on Inside Europe, we're counting our chickens. Literally. That's because of what our reporter Danny Mitzman assures us is a growing trend in Italy, keeping hens so that you can produce your own eggs. Not recommended for urban apartment dwellers, but if you've got a garden, then listen up.
I'm in the kitchen of homeopathic vet Pietro Venezia on his farm just outside the town of Forlì. Featuring plenty of their fresh produce, his wife Laura's laid on a very tasty lunch for those attending today's course. Pietro's farm uses the technique of permaculture, a way of creating a sustainable and self-sufficient ecosystem, and central to this method are his chickens. He's been showing us around the spacious coop they share with his ducks. Together with permaculture specialist Andrea Minchio, they teach happy chicken husbandry.
We started courses like 5 years ago, and the courses were full. We always ask how is possible that a course on chicken is full of people interested in it. So that's why we decided to jump from the course to the book.
Galline Felici in Permacultura, which translates as Happy Hens in Permaculture, came out late last year. It's an exhaustive manual on how to create the ideal environment for your chooks. But for sure, the best way to get started is with one of their courses. Whether you've got a sprawling farm or just a little back garden, Pietro and Andrea explain how to build the perfect chicken coop and keep them clucking with delight.
Sono animali meravigliosi, secondo me. Abbiamo già delle galline adesso che abbiamo.
They are wonderful animals. We already have some hens, but having only got them recently, we've now realized you need to plan the chicken shed well and get to know the animals inside out to understand what's good and bad for them.
Per capire cosa gli fa star bene e cosa invece gli può far star male.
Caterina inherited 10 chickens from her late grandfather, but hopes to have a lot more on the farm she and her husband are planning to start.
Il mio compagno marito aveva.
My husband's already done the chickens in a permaculture course, which made us realize that my granddad's way of looking after them wasn't ideal. So we completely rebuilt the chicken coop. We saw that it really worked, and the chickens were happier in their improved space. My husband taught me some of the things he learned, but I think it's worth me doing the course too.
Ho colto l'occasione per farlo anch'io.
Across the table from Caterina is Angela. She's got a farm up in the mountains where she produces firewood and top-quality grass for horse feed.
I'm very interested in doing this Happy Hens course because apart from the fact that it's the first one I've ever heard of, I'm keen to learn a whole series of techniques so I'll be able to keep hens in a healthy and sustainable way. No, I don't, so it'll be a challenge to learn how to handle them in the best possible way for their health and mine.
Pietro has a genuine passion for chickens and teaches you how to create an area to give your animals freedom but also protection from predators. And he helps you design their indoor spaces with separate areas to roost and lay eggs. A far cry from industrial chicken farming.
The situation of chickens in the world is very sad. We're talking about billions of animals living in nothing, regarding the space that they have. And the fact that they never see the sky or the sun or a pasture. They have no social life, they have no sexual life. And if you're talking about chickens for meat, we're talking about animals that they live between 39 and 43 days. So they're just born and die. This is the reason why we want to share with the people some things that we know, to see if we can find better life for chickens. That is a wonderful animal.
Yeah, they scratch around, and so they reduce the dimension of the material, and this is very good for making compost. They also eat parasites like insects, flies, whatever. And in particular, they clean around the tree, below the tree, and on the trunk, the main trunk. Let's start with the compost. If you have chicken, you'll never throw anything away. The scraps of food you use for them, and then transform the scrap food in eggs. Or you can use chicken like pets in a way that you can work with them, like pet therapy.
So I love chickens. I've always wanted to have chickens, and I moved here a year ago, and I just love being around the chickens. I find them so relaxing to be with.
Teresa, who comes from the UK, lives here on the farm. She says she totally understands why Pietro and Andrea's courses are so popular.
I think there is that, connection to knowing where your food's coming from and things like that. And just to be able to go and get the eggs and to be able to, throw them the scraps of your food and then they give you eggs. It's just like a present.
Pietro tells me chickens are among the most adaptable animals in the world, which is why you'll find them in the hottest and coldest corners of the globe. And while having a rooster stimulates egg laying, if you're worried about neighbours complaining about the early morning wake-up call, Pietro and Andrea assure me that you can stick to hens only. But there is one question they still haven't answered.
I have to ask, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Nice question. We know the answer.
Go on then.
Dinosaurs. If you have time to see the fingers of the chicken, the millions of years ago.
But even those dinosaurs came from eggs.
Came from eggs. So first the egg or first the dinosaurs? I don't know.
But for sure, first the dinosaurs.
Before the chickens, definitely.
From Meldolot, just outside Forli, this is Danny Mitzman for DW.
You know what, I feel like there's an egg joke to be made somewhere here, but you got to know how to crack them. That is the sound of the official after-party of Greenland's election-winning centre-right Democratic Party that won on a pro-business platform favouring a gradual approach to independence from Denmark. Almost 90% of Greenland's population is Greenlandic Inuit. The Inuit for Greenland is Kalalit Nunaat. But what does it mean? Does it mean land of snow, land of the people, or land of the winds? Head on over to Spotify and take a guess. This programme was produced by me, Kate Laycock, with help from Sam Baker and sound engineers Michael Springer and Ziad Abu Sleiman. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn.